The candles in the Sistine Chapel burned all night, not because anyone was praying, not because God had called his servants to their knees in holy vigil. They burned because one man, the man who now owned this palace, every gilded corridor, every confession booth soaked in centuries of whispered sin, had ordered the servants to keep the light going. He wanted to walk through his kingdom before anyone else woke up. He wanted to feel it. He wanted to breathe it in. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, and in the year 1492, after one of the most corrupt elections in the entire history of the Catholic Church, he became Pope Alexander VI, the most powerful man on earth. He was 61 years old. He had been waiting 30 years for this moment, and he was not going to waste a single second of it. Rome did not sleep that night either. Word spread through the city the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast, greedy, and impossible to stop. Torches appeared in windows. People poured into the streets. Some of them were celebrating. Some of them were calculating. And a small handful, the ones who'd known Rodrigo Borgia up close, the ones who'd watched him operate for decades, those people quietly closed their shutters, bolted their doors, and began to pray. Not for his success, for their own survival. Because they knew something the cheering crowds did not. They knew that the man who just inherited the Church of God was not a servant of that church. He was its new owner. And owners, as any Roman could tell you, did not manage their property. They consumed it. A 19-year-old cardinal named Giovanni de' Medici turned to the man riding beside him the night of Alexander's election and said very quietly, "Now we are in the claws of a wolf. He will devour us all unless we flee." He was not wrong. He just didn't flee fast enough. Now, to truly understand what Alexander did with the treasury of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, to feel the weight of it, the audacity of it, the sheer volcanic insanity of it, you have to understand who this man was before the white robes and the golden crown. Rodrigo Borgia was born in Valencia, Spain, in 1431. He was handsome the way a predator is handsome, not soft, not gentle, but compelling, magnetic, the kind of face you could not look away from even when something deep in your chest was telling you to run. He had heavy-lidded dark eyes that always seemed to be doing two things at once, listening to whatever you were saying and calculating something else entirely behind a wall of warm, practiced charm. His uncle was Pope Calixtus III, and the moment his uncle took the throne of St. Peter, Rodrigo's life changed overnight. At 26, he was made Vice-Chancellor of the Church, the second most powerful position in all of Catholicism, the man who controlled the daily administration of the Vatican, the money, the appointments, the favors, the machinery of an institution that stretched across the known world. He held that position for 35 years. 35 years of watching popes come and go. 35 years of learning exactly how the system worked, where every lever was hidden, who owned which secret, which cardinal could be bought, and which one needed to be destroyed. 35 years of accumulating wealth, influence, allies, and enemies. And through it all, he was doing something else, something that no Vatican official was supposed to be doing at all. He was raising a family. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. Rodrigo Borgia had children, multiple children with multiple women. He had a long and deeply passionate relationship with a Roman noblewoman named Vanozza de Catania, and together they had 4 children who would go on to become some of the most feared names in all of Renaissance Italy. There was Cesare, brilliant and terrifying, the son who would become a cardinal at 17 and a warlord by 25. There was Juan, reckless and cruel, the son his father tried to make into a military general. There was Joffre, the youngest, who mostly just tried to stay out of the way. And then there was Lucrezia Borgia, whose name even 500 years later makes historians pause before they speak. But we will get to Lucrezia. First, the money. When Alexander opened the Vatican's account books for the first time as Pope, what he found was staggering. The Church of Rome was not simply a spiritual institution, it was a financial empire, one of the wealthiest organizations in the history of the world. It collected tithes from parishes across all of Europe. It charged fees for every appointment, every official letter bearing the papal seal. It sold indulgences, which means it sold people the forgiveness of their sins, God's mercy available at a negotiated price. It owned property across the continent. It loaned money to kings. Alexander looked at all of it, and then he got to work. The first thing he did was throw an election party that Rome would talk about for a generation. Not a quiet, pious ceremony, not a solemn procession and a prayer. He threw open the Vatican and invited the entire city in. There were feasts that lasted for days. There was music, not hymns, but dancing music, the kind that made your whole body move whether you wanted it to or not. There was wine flowing so freely that the servants stopped counting the barrels. There were fireworks over the Tiber River that turned the night sky orange and gold and made children scream with joy and old men weep from sheer excess. The cardinals watched from their seats. Some of them smiled. They knew they were going to benefit from this papacy, but some of them sat very still with careful, empty expressions on their faces, because they had made a terrible mistake in voting for this man, and they were only just beginning to understand what it meant. One cardinal, an elderly, ambitious man named Giuliano della Rovera, who had desperately wanted the papacy for himself, stood at a window and watched the fireworks in complete silence. He was making different calculations. I will wait. I will be patient. My time will come. He was right. History would remember him as Pope Julius II, the man who spent the next decade trying to clean up everything Alexander left behind. But that story belongs to the end of this one. Within months of his election, Alexander transformed his private chambers at the Vatican. The rooms that had belonged to previous popes, austere, simple, the furniture of men who at least performed the theater of holy poverty, were completely gutted. He brought in the most celebrated artist in Rome, a painter named Pinturicchio, and he covered those chambers in frescoes of such gorgeous excess that even today, standing in those rooms, visitors feel slightly dizzy. Pinturicchio painted the sky of ancient Egypt on one ceiling. He painted portraits of Alexander's own family, disguised as saints and angels. He painted the gods of pagan Rome, standing side by side with the apostles of Christ, because Alexander saw no contradiction there. He spent 80,000 ducats on those rooms alone. To put that in context, 80,000 ducats was what an entire Italian city-state spent on its military budget for a full year, and that was just decoration. The real spending, the spending that consumed the treasury the way a fire consumes dry wood, happened in places that never made it into official records. That happened in the back channels of a papacy that operated, underneath its golden surface, like a crime family wearing religious robes. To understand where the money truly went, you have to follow three threads at the same time. The first thread was his son, Cesare. The second was his daughter, Lucrezia. And the third, the one that made everything else possible, the thread that connected the holy and the monstrous, was the poison. When Alexander became pope, Cesare Borgia was 17 years old and had already been made the bishop of Pamplona. At 18, his father made him a cardinal. And then, at 23, Cesare did something no cardinal in the entire history of the Catholic Church had ever done before. He resigned. He took off the red robes, he handed back the ring, and he looked his father in the eyes and asked for something completely different. He didn't want to be a prince of the church. He wanted to be a prince. He wanted armies. He wanted castles. He wanted the blood and thunder of actual power, not the perfumed corridors of Vatican politics. And Alexander, who adored this son with the kind of helpless, unguarded love that even monsters are capable of, gave him everything he asked for. He gave Cesare the church's military resources. He gave him papal authority to negotiate with the King of France, which meant Cesare arrived at the French court carrying a treasure chest that made a king's eyes go wide. He gave him a French princess to marry. He gave him, in effect, a blank check drawn on the account of the Holy Catholic Church, and he asked for only one thing in return: conquer central Italy for the Borgia family. Historians usually describe this in careful diplomatic language, consolidating the states, creating a buffer against foreign powers. But strip away the language of statecraft, and what it really was is simple. It was a father spending the treasury of Christianity to build a private empire for his son. Cesare went to work. He moved through the Romagna, the central region of Italy that technically belonged to the church, but had been divided into lordships by a dozen noble families, like a storm front moving across open water. He took Imola, he took Faenza, he took Rimini, Pesaro, and Cesena. He took them with armies equipped by papal money, mercenaries paid by papal money, artillery pieces and horses, and entire supply chains funded by papal money.
And when negotiation failed, when a city's lords refused to simply hand over their keys, he used different methods. Because Cesare Borgia was, by almost every account that survived him, one of the most frightening human beings of his generation. He was physically enormous, 6 feet tall in an era when 5.5 feet was considered large. He wore a mask in public because syphilis had scarred his face, and he refused to be seen that way. He was capable of extraordinary personal courage and extraordinary personal cruelty, with, apparently, the exact same emotional temperature. He did not rage, he did not gloat, he simply acted, and then he moved on. And the cities he passed through were, afterward, different cities. The story of Ramiro de Lorca is the one that stays with you. Ramiro was Cesare's governor in the Romagna. He had been brutal in his administration, too brutal, it was said, so brutal that the people were on the edge of open rebellion. And one morning, the citizens of the city of Cesena woke up, walked to the central square, and stopped. Ramiro de Lorca was there, in 2 pieces. His body lay in the middle of the square. His head, still wearing its expression of apparent surprise, was mounted on a wooden pike beside it. A bloody knife lay on the ground next to him. No explanation was offered, no announcement was made. None was needed. Word traveled fast. The other cities behaved themselves.
Niccolo Machiavelli. Yes, that Machiavelli, the man who wrote the most famous book about political power in history, spent months traveling with Cesare and studying him the way a scientist studies a dangerous and magnificent creature. He wrote that this act left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. Machiavelli went home from that journey and wrote a book. He called it The Prince. Cesare Borgia was the model. All of those campaigns cost money, enormous, staggering, cathedral-building quantities of money, and Alexander paid every single invoice. But the Romagna campaign was only one thread. The second thread, the thread of Lucrezia, cost the treasury in a different way. It cost it in the currency of politics, which is to say, it cost it in the constant, expensive maintenance of alliances that were created, used, and then deliberately destroyed. Remember Lucrezia, blonde, beautiful, shaped since childhood into whatever her father needed her to be, a bargaining chip, a diplomatic tool, a living contract to be married off and recalled and married off again as the political winds shifted. She married 3 times before she was 22. Her first husband was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. She was 13 years old when Alexander arranged the marriage. Sforza came with the diplomatic weight of one of Italy's most powerful families, and for 4 years the alliance served its purpose. Then Pesaro became strategically useless, and the Sforza family became a liability. Alexander decided the marriage was over. Giovanni Sforza was a proud man. He refused the annulment. He dug in. He made the terrible mistake of underestimating just how serious the Borgias were about removing obstacles from their path. He began receiving whispers from his contacts in Rome, warnings he couldn't quite decipher. People he trusted looked at him with expressions he couldn't read. And then, one night, riding back to Pesaro, a man he had never seen before quietly fell into step beside his horse and said, in a voice so low that only Giovanni could hear it, "My lord, if you value your life, do not return to Rome." Giovanni Sforza fled that night. He went home to Pesaro, and he thought carefully about everything he had seen. And then he did the only thing he had left. He started talking. He told people that the official Vatican story, that the annulment was granted on grounds of impotence, was a lie. He hinted at darker reasons. He implied things too dangerous to say clearly. He let people fill in the blanks themselves. The Borgias did not respond with denial. They responded with escalation. They pushed through the annulment with full papal authority, declared the marriage void as if it had never existed, and immediately moved to arrange the next one. Lucrezia's second husband was Alfonso of Aragon. He was young, handsome, genuinely kind, and by all accounts, Lucrezia actually loved him, which in her world was either a mercy or the cruelest joke imaginable, because it meant the ending was going to hurt more. Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica in broad daylight. A group of armed men came for him and left him bleeding on the most sacred stones in Rome. He survived, barely, and was carried to his rooms in the Vatican to recover. His wounds were healing, he was getting better. And then, one afternoon, while his nurses had stepped away and his guards had somehow been called to other duties, something happened in that room. Exactly what happened has never been conclusively established. When the servants returned, Alfonso of Aragon was dead. Lucrezia never fully recovered from it, whatever that meant for a woman who had been shaped since childhood into an instrument of her father's will. She became quieter, more careful, more contained. She wrote poetry. She corresponded with artists and scholars. She moved through the world with a kind of sad, practiced grace that people who met her almost universally found deeply moving, because they could sense the thing underneath it without being able to name it. She was eventually married a third time to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. This marriage was held. She went to Ferrara, governed her duchy with genuine intelligence and skill, supported the arts, and died at 39 from complications after her 8th pregnancy. She outlived her father by 8 years and her brother Cesare Borgia by 5. Her final letter, written the day before she died, began with these words, "I write with one foot in paradise." Now we come to the third thread, the one that explains how Alexander not just spent the church's existing wealth, but how he generated new wealth to replace it. And this is where the story crosses from ambitious to criminal, from morally questionable to genuinely monstrous. Alexander ran a scheme of simony, the selling of church offices, on a scale that made his predecessors look like amateurs. Under his papacy, a cardinality had a price. The price varied depending on the importance of the position and the wealth of the buyer, but it was always real, always paid, and always went into accounts that Alexander personally controlled. In 1503, he created 12 new cardinals in a single stroke, 12 appointments at once. The income from those appointments alone, the fees, the donations, the grateful payments that flowed before and after each announcement, added up to what contemporaries estimated as hundreds of thousands of ducats. But the second method was darker, much darker. It involved the Vatican's famous banquets. The Borgias' reputation for poison is one of the most debated questions in Renaissance history. Some historians say the stories are exaggerated, the inventions of political enemies trying to destroy the family's name. Others say they are substantially true. The truth, as with most things Borgia, lives somewhere in the murky space between legend and documented fact. But here is what is documented. Wealthy men who dined with the Borgias had a statistically improbable tendency to die shortly afterwards, and their estates, their property, their money, their assets had a statistically improbable tendency to end up in the hands of the church, which is to say, in the hands of Alexander. The poison they allegedly used was called la cantarella. The name appears in multiple sources from the period. It was described as a white powder with a sweet taste. It worked slowly, not dramatically, not the theatrical writhing of an obvious poisoning. Instead, a gradual weakening, a mysterious fever, a slow decline that looked to untrained eyes like the ordinary misfortune of living in a world without modern medicine. The Cardinal of Ferrara died mysteriously after dining with the Borgias. His estate passed to the church. The Cardinal of Orsini was arrested on unspecified charges and died in Castel Sant'Angelo. His estate passed to the church. Various other wealthy churchmen and nobles who had dined at the wrong tables at the wrong times developed mysterious ailments and died at remarkably convenient moments. Their estates passed to the church. The pattern was noticed. It was discussed in hushed voices in the circles of people who cared about staying alive. There was a dark joke that circulated through Rome during Alexander's entire papacy, the kind of joke that people laughed at too loudly because the alternative was not laughing at all. To be invited to dine with the Holy Father is to have one foot already in the next world. One witness account, written by a man named Johann Burckhardt, who was Alexander's own master of ceremonies and kept a meticulous personal diary of life inside the Vatican, records a banquet held in October of 1501 that has become one of the most discussed and disputed events of the entire Borgia story. Burckhardt was not a man given to exaggeration. His diary is remarkable precisely for its flat, almost bureaucratic tone, the voice of a man recording extraordinary events with the detachment of someone writing a daily ledger. He described what happened in those Vatican private chambers that October evening without emotion, without editorial comment, without anything that might be called appropriate horror. 50 women were invited. They were brought into a room lit by silver candelabras gleaming against frescoed walls. They danced,
They were given food and wine.
And then, according to Burchard, the evening shifted into something that no palace of any pope in the history of Christianity had ever hosted before. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor. The guests were made to crawl on all fours to collect them, and then Burchard records the rest without inflection, without comment. It became something else entirely. Historians have argued over this account for 500 years. Some say he exaggerated. Some say he recorded faithfully what he witnessed. But what is beyond all debate is this: he wrote it down at all. Which means that whatever happened in that room was not so impossible, not so unthinkable, not so far beyond what a man who had spent years in close proximity to Pope Alexander VI could imagine, that it strained his credulity. Think about that for a moment. Think about the people who lived through this papacy in real time. The cardinals, the bishops, the Vatican servants, the ordinary Roman citizens who went about their lives under a pope who was doing these things, and they knew it, and they could not say it clearly, and the institution of the church continued to function around that knowledge, the way a human body continues to function around a wound it cannot reach to treat. Some of them tried to speak. Girolamo Savonarola was the most famous. He was a Dominican friar from Florence, thin, intense, burning with a conviction that bordered on madness and genius in equal measure. He began preaching against the corruption of the church with a fire and specificity that made it absolutely clear he was not talking about abstract sins. He was talking about specific ones, named ones. He called Alexander out by name from his pulpit in Florence. He said, "I know what the Pope is. I know what he is doing. God's judgment is coming, and the men who enable this rot are as guilty as the man who commits it." Florence listened. For a remarkable, extraordinary period of several years, Savonarola had the entire city in the grip of his terrible urgency. People piled their luxury goods, their mirrors, their books, their silk clothes, their paintings, art we would now put in museums and call priceless, into great bonfires in the piazzas of Florence. They burned everything. In an ecstasy of repentance, the city remade itself completely in the image of his vision. Alexander watched this from Rome. And then, in 1498, he had Savonarola arrested, tried for heresy, and burned alive at the stake. The same piazza in Florence where Savonarola had held his great bonfires of repentance became the place where he himself was turned to ash. After the execution, Alexander declared a jubilee year back in Rome. He signed the death warrant, and then he ordered a feast. By this point, the Treasury was beginning to show the strain. 35 years of accumulated wealth is a large reservoir, but it has a bottom, and Alexander's spending, the armies, the weddings, the palaces, the constant bribes, the banquets, the bribes within the banquets, the grinding daily cost of maintaining a criminal enterprise at the very center of the world's most powerful institution, was finding that bottom. He accelerated everything. He sold more church offices. He created indulgences on a scale that made even his most mercenary predecessors look conservative. He taxed the clergy, then taxed them again. He levied crusade tithes, money collected from faithful Christians across all of Europe, supposedly to fund a military campaign against the Ottoman Turks. The campaign never happened. The money vanished. And then came August of 1403. The heat in Rome that summer was savage, the kind that makes stone streets radiate warmth at midnight, that turns the Tiber into a slow brown sickness, that kills the old and the weak and gives the young a feverish, dangerous energy. It was the season when the wealthy fled to their country estates, and the people who couldn't flee simply endured it and buried their dead. On the 14th of August, Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare attended a private dinner at the villa of Cardinal Adriano da Corneto. Da Corneto was a very wealthy man. He had estates across Italy, a fine art collection, and assets that, had they passed to the church under the right circumstances, would have made a significant contribution to the depleted treasury. Within days of that dinner, both Alexander and Cesare were sick. Within a week, Alexander was dying. His physicians did everything they knew: bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayer. None of it helped. His body was failing too fast. On the 18th of August, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. He was 72 years old.
He had been pope for 11 years. The whisper that spread in Rome in the hours that followed was the same whisper that has echoed through history ever since, that the Borgias had prepared poison for Cardinal Adriano da Corneto at that dinner, that the glasses had somehow been confused, that the hunter had drunk from the cup meant for the prey. Whether that is true, no one can say with certainty. What can be said with certainty is this: it was the ending that felt to the people of Rome like the hand of God. Within hours of his death, before his body had even been moved from the room in which he died, the servants who had been quietly waiting for this moment stripped the Vatican of everything portable. Tapestries came off the walls, silver candlesticks vanished, the private treasury Alexander had kept separate from the church's official accounts, the accumulated personal savings of 11 years of papacy, disappeared completely in the chaos of those first hours. His body was laid out for viewing in the August heat, and what happened over the following days became some of the most Gothic passages in the entire historical record. The Roman summer did what the Roman summer does. The body swelled, it darkened. People who came to confirm with their own eyes that this man was finally gone found a scene that, to the deeply superstitious minds of 15th century Catholics, looked exactly like divine judgment made visible. Cardinals who had planned to kneel in formal reverence found they could not stay in the room. They buried him quickly, in a ceremony that was, for a pope, notably bare. The grand funeral rites that should have marked the passing of the Vicar of Christ were cut short, rushed, reduced to the minimum. There was apparently something appropriate about that. Cesare survived the illness, but he was never the same. Something had broken in him, whether it was the poison, whether it was malaria from that brutal Roman summer, or whether it was something else entirely, no one can say. What is certain is that without his father's papacy behind him, Cesare Borgia was just a very dangerous man without institutional backing, and in the Italy of 1503, that was a precarious thing to be. He fled, he fought, he made alliances and watched them collapse one by one. He ran out of options the way a man runs out of road, suddenly, at speed, with nowhere left to turn. He died 3.5 years after his father, in a skirmish outside a small town called Viana in Spain. He was unhorsed during the fight. The men who surrounded him didn't know who he was. They stabbed him 23 times before anyone thought to check his identity. He was 31 years old. The man who became the next pope was Giuliano della Rovere, the cardinal who had stood at the window watching Alexander's election fireworks 23 years earlier, making his quiet calculations. The man who had waited in exile, patient and furious for 2 decades. He took the papal name Julius II. And when Julius sat down with his treasurers and auditors and began the forensic work of figuring out what the Vatican treasury contained when Alexander took power and what it contained now, the gap was almost impossible to look at directly. 11 years. The entire accumulated financial reserve of the Holy Catholic Church gone. Into armies that conquered cities that now needed to be reconquered, into palaces that stood empty, into marriages that produced neither lasting alliances nor legitimate heirs, into private accounts of a man who loved his children the way only a man without conscience can love, unconditionally, which is to say, dangerously, which is to say, as both his greatest tenderness and his most terrible act. Into banquets that nobody wrote about in the official records, but that everybody in Rome talked about in hushed and slightly disbelieving voices for the rest of their lives. Julius looked at the ruins and did what rulers do with ruins. He built. He commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, the building that stands in Rome today. One of the greatest architectural achievements in human history was begun by Julius as a monument to replace what Alexander's reign had invisibly hollowed out. He commissioned the painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He hired Michelangelo. You have stood in the Sistine Chapel, or you have seen photographs of it, and you have felt that particular catch in the chest, that thing beauty does when it is large enough to overwhelm your capacity to remain unmoved. What you were feeling, without knowing it, was partially an act of reparation. A man cleaning up after a disaster, using the greatest artists in the world as his tools, building something so magnificent that it would make people forget, or at least forgive, what had come before.